Amy Nemecek tonight on her recently published book, The Language of the Birds. So I'm so glad you all could make it here tonight. Amy, as many of you may know, works for Baker Publishing Group as an editor of nonfiction books. Some of you might not know she used to work here at Baker Book House years ago. And this place is pretty special.
A lot of years ago.
A lot of years, long time history.
Yeah.
And special to you for many reasons, one of which, of course, this is where Amy met her husband, Sean. Sean is here with us tonight, as is their son, Ben. Hello, Ben. Glad you guys are both here. And then Amy and I met through mutual friends a few years ago, and then we were part of a small group for worship during the pandemic.
We were,
Yes.
we 7, right?
Yes.
The 7 of us, yeah.
We did. That was very special.
It was.
And now Amy and I are both enrolled in the same cohort with the Soul Care Institute. We also are fans of Dorothy L. Sayers and all things England.
Yes. That's right.
So a lot of great connections
Yeah, for sure.
in our friendship.
For
So,
sure.
but really pleased to be able to
Thank
be
you.
here.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for being here tonight. This is fun. Like, I'm looking out and I'm seeing this amazing cross section of my life right in front of me. Like, I love every one of you people, whether you are family or coworkers, teachers from my college days, friends from my writing conference and my poetry group. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Yeah, and I do want to also mention, I don't know if all of you realize that Amy was awarded the 2021 Paraclete Poetry Prize for the language of birds, which is
Thank you.
and I'm hoping this is going to be the first of other collections that will be published.
I hope so, yeah, I hope so too, Sue. Yeah, that was an exciting announcement when my dear friend Ann Bile, several people in this room were present at that table at Denise's house, and when she had read the press release that I had won, she thought I knew, and I did not, so surprise. That was a fun evening, and I also want to mention I was a co-winner of that prize, and Angela Alima O'Donnell, her book also won, her book Holy Land, and that was released the same day as mine. I heard her read last week on a Paraclete Press event, and she's amazing. So check that one out too. So,
Great.
yeah.
Well, just to kind of give you an idea, I'm going to ask Amy a few questions. She's going to read a few of her poems, and we will have some time for Q&A towards the end of our time. So my first question for you, Amy, is how did this book come about?
Yeah, so I've been writing poetry for a lot of years. Back in my college days, I started getting a few things published here and there. And then through the years, as I continued to write, I had friends through a writers conference I was part of. They really encouraged me to keep sending my work out there. And there are a lot of literary journals. So for about every 12 submissions I would send out, I might get one acceptance letter. So gradually that list built. Like, I finally had, more than a dozen poems that were in print in various places. And so I started to collect them into this book. And it kind of went through different, it morphed from the time that I first collected them to now. And so I really felt like it was in a place where I wanted to send it to this Paraclete Poetry Prize. And I prayed that it would do well. when I was shortlisted in the top 10, I was really excited, but I thought I saw some of the other people I was up against, and I did not think that it would happen. And then I was very grateful that Scott Cairns, who is an amazing poet, he was the judge and he selected mine. And so I titled it The Language of the Birds because it is the title poem for the collection. It's the very first poem in here. And it's a really special poem to me. It's in a book over in the fiction section. It's in a book by Susie Finkbeiner called The Nature of Small Birds. And she read this poem and said, I want it. Give it to me. Can I put it in my book as a frontispiece? And so it is in there. And so I'll read this if that's okay.
Can I ask
Yeah.
you, when people hear the title of the book, do they ask you what your book is about?
What's the book about? They think it's talking birds. I don't know. So I chose the title just because this is one of my favorite poems from the book. And I thought that it really captured well what I'm trying to do here. The language of the birds is like this mythical language that was supposedly spoken in the Garden of Eden. It's been lost to history, right? But supposedly the birds still know this language according to legend. And so I felt like we can hear God's voice. Like God obviously knew this language, right? He created it. And so I wrote this poem kind of based on that premise, and just how we hear him in our day-to-day lives. So I'll read it and start there. The language of the birds. On the fifth day, your calloused fingers stretched out and plucked a single reed from the river that flowed out of Eden, trimmed its hollow shaft to length and whittled one end to a precise bead that you dipped in the inkwell of ocean, touching pulpy nib to papyrus sky, you brushed a single hieroglyph, feathered the vertical downstroke, flourished with serif of pinions, a perpendicular crossbar lifting weightless bones from left to right. Tucking the stylus behind your ear, you blew across the wet silhouette, dried a raven's wings against the static, and spoke aloud the symbol's sound. Fly. So that was me imagining God at creation, writing this mythical language, the language of the birds, writing a character for the word fly. So, and it was a response to an image I had seen of a bird against statues.
Beautiful, thank you. So Amy, how were you introduced to poetry? What drew you?
Yeah. I remember learning it in elementary school, in language arts, you have your poetry unit, right? And I remember that vividly because I enjoyed writing things like haiku and cinquain and limericks when we got to learn about those, yeah. And I remember my third grade teacher, Mrs. Barber, at Millbrook Christian School, and she would take the kids' drawings, or in this case it was a poem, and put it in a little newsletter format and send it home to the school. Well, one of my poems, actually two of my poems, got in that newsletter, and yes, so third grade Amy wrote about fall. Wait, why I like fall. I like fall for ghostly Halloween. I like fall for super trick or treat. I like fall. It's the best season of all. So my very first published piece, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I had a thing for rhyme because the other poem was the biggest tree that I could see. fell in the creek just last week. So I was rhyming then, but I think even before that, I remember being read poetry. And I remember, I was thinking this today, Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses. And I had this, big golden book of it. And it was amazing. And I can still, like, The Land of Counterpane, I still love that poem, or The Swing, I love those. And another thing that really, the Psalms are poems. They're the Bible's poetry book, God's poetry book. And I remember we would read usually a psalm at the close of every meal as I was growing up. And so I think that's probably my earliest time of being, having poetry just wash over me day in and day out. And I actually kind of wrote a poem sort of about that, about those early influences at least. So ecclesiology is the study of the church, right? And so I wrote this poem remembering my childhood, and it's called Ecclesiology 101. 9 of us take up a whole row. I'm wedged between my parents. The bare backs of my thighs peel from the creaking pew when we all stand to sing. My mother lifts me until my white sandaled feet are tiptoeing the bench, and my eyes are level with Dad's sandpaper chin. Her right hand steadies me. His left hand holds a hymnal. I slide to sitting for the sermon, measure minutes watching a wall-mounted fan oscillate Dad's neat-slicked part into a schoolboy cowlick. God's here. He smells like spray starch, shaving soap, Old Spice, and the wintergreen candy that powders Dad's pocket in sticky sweet pink. And so that's a love of God's word and a love of words were instilled in me at a young age.
That is something that has really impressed me, how much you love words and are truly a wordsmith.
Yeah, when I was freelancing, I was a freelance editor for a lot of years before I came back to work in-house for Baker, and that was my business card, was freelance wordsmith, right? So thank you. I do love words. I remember before I even could write, I really wanted to go to school, you guys. I was the youngest of 7 kids, and they were all in school, and I wasn't. I didn't get to go. But my sister Jane would teach me she taught me how to read. She taught me like the bones of the body and all sorts of things that she was learning in junior high. And that's how she studied. She taught her little sister. But I didn't know how to write, but I had all these stories and things in my head. And I remember sitting at my little Holly Hobby desk in the back of the den with paper. Mom would just give me paper and pencils, and she'd pack me a lunch in my brother's old football lunchbox, and I'd go to school. And I would sit and I would write, I would scribble, and I wasn't writing letters. I was just writing, but then I would read what I had written to her or whoever would listen. I would read these things. So even pre-written language, I was writing stories, making up stories and things like that. So I do love words.
Yeah, amazing.
And for anyone who has not yet read Amy's poetry, you might want a dictionary close at hand. And it's totally fine to look up the words.
It is.
They're
Please look up the
wonderful
word.
words.
Thank you. Thank you.
Expanding my vocabulary for sure.
Well, so I just want to say, people are like, well, why did you use that word? It's like you have to look it up. And I say, well, it was the right word. Any other word wouldn't have worked. This was the right word. And it's okay if you have to look it up.
Yeah.
So,
So, Amy, what do you personally enjoy about poetry?
For me, I always feel like a poem makes space for me, and it makes space in me. When I'm writing one, I feel like there's space for my soul to breathe, and I process a lot of things through poetry. When I was in college, when my mom died, I wrote a lot of poetry after that, processing a lot of that grief and things like that. And it's not just bad things that I process through that. It's good things too. And I hope that when people read my poems, I've had a number of people say to me, I know you were writing that about you, but like I connected with that because I've had something like that happen. And so that means a lot to know that people can connect with a poem and find space to, in some cases, even maybe hear God saying something to them that they might not have known was stirring in their soul. It's a lot of times that's how like when a poem gets finished, I'll look at it and think, well, I didn't know that was going on inside of me. I wrote, like we just got done with elections, and a number of years ago, in a very divisive election year, I wrote this poem actually, and I'll just read it. It's not a long one. And I got done, and when I wrote the last line, like it sat there unfinished for a long time. And then one day I wrote the last two lines of this poem, and I realized, oh, okay, I see. Okay, God, I hear you. I'll keep watching, but the poem's called Hope Deferred, and that comes from the saying, hope deferred makes the heart sick, right? Maybe is that in Proverbs too? I don't know, maybe. Hope deferred. I arrived late without a lesson plan. Two things a teacher must never do. Yet I find myself perpetually unprepared this divisive November. How long, oh Lord? My Sunday school students teeter on metal chairs around a folding table as perforated boredom shudders their eyelids. Will you look away forever? My century heart grows footsore, watching for the dawn. And so when I got those last two lines, I was like, yeah, okay. Sometimes keeping watch for Jesus coming back, it's long. The days get long some years. And so I wrote that, and I was able to acknowledge that and then go on. So
I think one of the things that I've appreciated as I've read through your poetry, and I'm not one that is well acquainted with a lot of poetry. I don't read poetry broadly, other than what's in scripture. But you have a way of doing what you were just saying, of pausing and observing and reflecting on everyday moments. Like very everyday moment that I think does make it very relatable for other people.
yeah, I mean, life happens in the everyday, and I think that's just honest. It's just being honest as a writer that these are my ordinary moments. And yeah, I mean, I just had a friend from Colorado. She called me last week. It was a really encouraging call. She had been reading my poems, a couple poems a day. She said she was grazing so that she didn't just devour it all. Yeah, But she called me, it meant so much because she said there was this one poem. And it really like made space in my soul to hear God's voice from just an ordinary everyday thing. For autumn leaves. I write a lot in the autumn season. I do, and I will say that autumn has usually been a very fruitful season for me as a writer. But this one, I'm just gonna read this because if Angie's watching this, I wanna read it because she loves it. It's called Streets of Gold. And the epigraph to the poem is 2 lines from another poem by John Donne, who is one of my favorites. And it says, in heaven it is always autumn. His mercies are ever in their maturity. Who says the golden paths we'll walk are paved with cold, hard ingots? My feet fly over a roadbed of coins that flutter from aspens in perfectly heart-shaped currency. For all the leaves descending, the wealth does not deplete. Branches are never cold and bare, but always warm and glowing, like flames on an autumn hearth. And I remember the day I wrote that poem, where we used to live, we had aspen trees in our front yard, a lot of them, and I was raking a lot of aspen leaves. And I just remember thinking, I hope in heaven it's always autumn. Because it is my favorite time. But yeah, so just ordinary moments as a mom, as a wife, as a Christian, just yeah.
Well, I have to be honest though, too. I mean, so here around Baker Book House, we often ask each other, what are you reading? Or what do you like to read? And frankly, I can't think of anyone who has said as their first response, oh, I've just read a poem. Or I'm reading a book of poetry. Do you think that people are reluctant to read poetry?
I do. I think for a long time, I think that poetry, some people almost saw it as an academic exercise. Only other poets read poetry. You only wrote poetry for other poets to read because they were the only ones who could understand what you meant. I think that those days, I hope that those days are past. There are so many amazing poets. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. I mean, Mary Oliver is one of my favorites.
Oh, yeah.
And her poetry is just very down to earth. Earthy is a really good word for her, actually. And people can connect with that deeply. Lucy Shaw, to me, is the same way. I was introduced to Lucy Shaw's poetry while I was in college. And she had been writing for a lot longer than, for a long time, and I hadn't ever read her before. But I think one of the greatest moments ever was when I got her email with an endorsement for this book. And she's 93 years old. She's an amazing lady. Whenever I think of Lucy, the word I think of is evergreen. Like, she just is always green. Just her work is always fresh and new. But yeah, I think people maybe get intimidated by poetry. Billy Collins, another poet I love a lot. He has this poem called Introduction to Poetry. And he talks about how he's trying to teach like introduction to, like, I wanted you to, I can't remember how the whole thing goes. I wanted you to do this with the poem, and I wanted you to see this in the poem. Not in the poem, but I wanted you to, I wish I brought it. The last part of it, he says, but all you want to do is tie it to a chair and beat it until it tells you what it means. Which is kind of what we're taught to do maybe in literature classes in high school, where you have to analyze it. And so it doesn't have to be intimidating. Just bring curiosity to it. And not every poem's gonna connect with you. Don't expect it to. Just flip the page and go to the next one, and maybe the next one will, or maybe that poet won't connect with you. If you ever need suggestions about poems to read, just or poets to try, just let me know. But there's a poem in this book about my dad. Actually, a number of poems in this book about my dad, but this one is called Dad Never Reads Poetry. I'll just read it because I think you'll get it when I read it, because I don't quite know how to explain it, but my dad would not have just picked up a book of poetry and read it. He just wouldn't. Dad never reads poetry, except the Psalms and Hallmark cards he buys Mom for her birthday. He spends his time tinkering with two-stroke Maytag motors, rebuilding the engine on his Model T Ford, resuscitating elegiac tractors. Dad composes sonnets with grease and gears, the rhyme scheme and rhythm, carburetors and camshafts. Mary Oliver mystifies him, but he can scan the beat of his Oliver Baylor while it chugs iambic pentameter through summer hay fields, baling twine, knotting the end of every line as green gold verses slide off the chute to land in perfectly spaced stubbled rows. I think we all have some poetry in us somewhere. For my dad, it was fixing things, but there was a poetry to what he did. And I think if we're curious, I think that we can all enjoy it and make space for it in our lives and appreciate it. So
I know I'm interested now in broadening my reading of poetry, and I am happy to say I had a phone call with a friend just yesterday, and she was asking me what I've read lately. And so I told her about your book,
Yeah.
and I pulled it out, and I started reading some of these poems, which I did discover it takes some practice to read poetry out loud. But
it's kind of a lost art, right? I mean, people used to do it.
Yeah.
Children used to have to recite it in school, but it is a lost art.
But even as I stumbled through, she was intrigued. She said, "This is really good." She said, "I think I just need somebody to recommend poetry to me."
And that is a big thing because, so a really great kind of, if you want to just get your feet wet and see what you like and what you don't like, there's a really good book on the shelf here in the humanities section back there where my book is. Also from Paraclete Press, and it released the same day, maybe the week before this one, and it's a Christian poets from 1940 on, and so it's kind of a smattering of some of the, like Scott Cairns, I think Christian Lyman's in it, Angela Alima O'Donnell's in it, Tanya Runyon. There's a lot of poets represented. I think there's about 30 or 40 poets represented in that book. So it's on the shelf back there. And yeah, so.
Well, Amy, could you kind of walk us through the structure of your book? And then we read a few more poems, and then we can still have time for a Q&A.
Yeah. So the book is broken up into 3 sections. And whoever, I do not know the name of the person who designed the interior of my book, but they did an amazing job because they put a little picture on the part openers, and I was just in love. Okay, so there's this little bird. So the first part, these are actually, I don't want to call them spiritual poems, but they are more spiritual in nature. They deal with spiritual themes. And so whether that's responding to scripture, maybe a story from scripture, responding to, there's a couple of them that respond to headlines that I saw, but they happened like Palm Sunday 2017 happened on Palm Sunday, and so there's, yeah, I enjoy the practice of Lectio Divina, which is holy reading, right? Yeah, and so it's where you listen to scripture. There's a rhythm to it. You hear it, you meditate on it, you contemplate it, and you pray it. And so when I do that, quite often I'll see things that I didn't see before. And so for instance, I'll just read this one. This is called Rooster Crow, and it's about Peter denying Christ. But maybe not as we've ever thought through that story before. Tradition tells us, Peter, that after one night's disavowal, you never heard morning's call without mourning. At Rooster Crow, you went out and wept bitterly, and its sound forever triggered startled sobs like waking from dreams of falling. Yet I wonder, the prisms that glisten on your eyelids now, faraway failures refracted in roomy lens, whether these are laments of gratitude, of bitter joy, that despite denial, his mercies are new every morning. Embrace then this alarum, this waking to his great faithfulness. And I've read the story of Peter's denial, and I had read that Peter, for the rest of his life, when he heard a rooster crow, he would choke up, he would tear up. And I got thinking about Peter as an old man. I happened to have been reading one of his letters in the New Testament, and I thought of him and how much time he probably had to reflect on that through his travels and his imprisonment and what it ultimately meant for him. So the first part of the book is going to be more spiritual themed poems. The second part, all nature poems. I already read Streets of Gold from that section. And then I'm really sorry about that. Wow, this is my first time using one of these, even though I'm married to a pastor. I have never actually had one of these things on, so I know what he always goes through. So I wrote this. This poem is called Like Eating a Plum. And there's a lot of layers to this poem for me personally, but it's based on this headline from the Grand Rapids Press on January 30th, 2017. And the headline says, Michiganders have barely seen the sun since December. Friends, we had 19 minutes of sunshine from like December 8th to February 8th. It was like a 2-month period. It's horrible. Like eating a plum. When sunshine is measured in minutes, not hours or days, you have to pluck it as soon as it's ripe. Open the door to an icebox yard, snatch light from a blue sky bowl, sink teeth into the pulpy golden orb, turning light snow dazzling. Slurp, suck, savor every delicious ray, so sweet and so cold. Spit the pale bare stone behind another round of gray. The two layers to that poem are not just what was going on in my ordinary everyday life, but it's based on a William Carlos Williams poem. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. They they were so sweet and so cold. So I took that and played with it. But then also, my mother always used to say when we were visiting my grandma in New Jersey, and the week was done, we were saying goodbye to grandma, and she would say, It's just like eating a plum, isn't it, Mom? Because it goes so fast, it's done. So she always used to say that. So nature poems, part 2. And then the last part is a lot of family-based poems. They have a family theme, whether it's my childhood family, my parents, my siblings, or my own experiences. I have a couple of poems in here from when I was going through cancer treatments. So a lot of these poems go, they're not all recent poems. There's like probably 20 years worth of poems collected here. Yeah, I'm gonna read one actually about my grandmother. Yeah. We have time, okay. My grandmother's breakfast. She pulls a juicy sun from a mesh bag on the counter, rolls it between her palms, carves it into equal hemispheres. Plating one, its ruby carpels glowing like a rose window in January's glim dawn. She carries it to the table where a bowl of cereal awaits her daily rites. She settles heavily into a spindleback chair, adjusts skirt and stockings, picks up a paring knife and slides its slender blade around circumference to separate fruit from rind, then cuts either side of tracery membranes, releasing supple panes. After she's savored each acidic wedge, the empty peel is a limp asterisk she folds halfwise, squeezes pulpy dregs spoon by a careful spoonful. Only then will she enjoy soggy squares bobbing in milk. Sweets to follow sour, never the other way round. And sip scalding amens of coffee, benedictions on the day. And they used, in the second part of my book, they used a grapefruit there on the part opener. But yeah, so, and it was fun to write that one because I was actually able to, my grandmother's name was Rose, and so I was able to work her name into the poem, just kind of sneak it in there, right? So yeah, and then a lot of memories in that particular last section of the book. And even a few, one of the more recent poems was from our 2017 trip. Sean and Ben and I took a trip to the UK, and I got to go to Poets Corner and Westminster Abbey and spend, oh, Sean, how many, we spent 2 hours in Poets Corner maybe. He had to drag me out. But I'm gonna read this one because it's fun, it's happy. Some of my poems tend to, they're a little, they taper off into sadness a little bit maybe, but this one is fun. And it comes because one of the vergers there, who's like on staff and he walks around talking to people. And he came over and he struck up a conversation with me about Edmund Spenser, the English poet from, was he 14th century? When was Spenser? No, he was Shakespeare, sorry. He was in the time of Shakespeare. So yeah, so like 16th, 17th century. Yeah, one of my college profs is here, so I have to get this right. And he was telling me like that they didn't quite know where Spenser was buried. And someone had tried to find the tomb, but they didn't know. So there was, because I had been looking at the plaque on the wall. And he's like, well, he's not there. It's just a plaque, right? So, but he was telling us this really cool story about when Spenser was buried, that there, and this kind of tells that story, okay? That his colleagues had all stood around his grave. They had all composed a poem, a sonnet for in loving memory of Edmund Spenser, and they threw them in the grave before it was covered. in the church here. And one of the poets who was there was Shakespeare. And so there's like, they wanted to find it because there's an original Shakespeare sonnet in that grave somewhere, like, but they never found it. So then I got thinking, what's this gonna be like someday? Standing in Poets Corner on Resurrection Day. From where I stand on these well-trod tiles, I watch Handel rise first. He's called from silent sepulchre by a trumpet, pulsing clarion triads he composed in life. Browning stretches, flexes stiff fingers, takes up a pen to dash lines to his Portuguese, herself newly untuned in faraway Florence. Chaucer drapes an arm across Dickens' shoulders, and with faces upturned to the Abbey's vaulted sky, they laugh a light fantastic to be among so great a cloud of witnesses. When Spenser springs from his secret vault, a quill tucked behind one ear and fisting his fellow poets' manuscript memorials, he shreds the priceless paper into joyous confetti that scatters like apple blossoms. Tattered laments land on Kipling's shoulders, but Tennyson brushes them into a cupped palm, flings them into the face of Ben Jonson, who assembles a sonnet of mourning into dance. I wish I could be there on Resurrection Day, because that would be fun to see, like, yeah. It's like a who's who of great poetry. So, yeah, so that kind of, a lot of stories in that third section, whether they're my own stories or made up stories. There are made up stories in there, including the one about Prospect Park. It's sort of made up and it's sort of, yeah, it's a lot of things, so.
That's so great to hear kind of your
Thank you.
processes in creating so many of these wonderful poems.
Thank you, it's fun to write them.
You obviously are enjoying it, and it's a joy to read them. So let's, we do still have a few minutes. Let's open it up for
Yeah.
some Q&A.
If anyone has questions,
Yeah.
feel free. Emily.
How did you pick your poems? Do you just have journals full of poems from years?
Yeah, sure. Emily was asking how I picked the poems for this collection, and that's a great question. First of all, anything that was ever published in a journal is in this. And there's a list in the back where they first appeared. And then, yeah, I keep, so like on my computer, I have year by year what I've written. And each poem has its own little folder, and then there's like, I keep every draft.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, there's a couple poems in here where there's, like 26 drafts of the poem. And some of them, there might be 3 drafts, and actually, the language of the birds, there's 1 draft. 1 draft, Susie St. French. It was just meant for you. Yeah, it was, yeah. And so I went through and I chose ones that I loved a lot, that I considered were good. And that kind of fit together. So like the nature poems, and I knew I needed like 75-ish poems to be able to enter this contest. So does that, yeah, Richard?
To follow up on Emily's
Sure.
question, did a publisher, let me say, did you submit more than required?
I did not.
And did the publisher have any decision-making over you?
Okay, so Richard asks if I had submitted more poems than what are in here to the publisher, and whether the publisher had decision-making power over what went in and what didn't. And the answer is no. There's actually 2 more poems than what I originally submitted. I subtracted 1 and I added two, so maybe there's only one more total.
Mhm.
But they matched me up with an editor who, she was amazing to work with. And she helped me see like, maybe we could move this one here and it would make a nice bookend for this section. So I'm trying to think, that was, yeah, so the second section, the nature poems, start with a poem called April Snow. And then it ends with just a 3-line poem called Stigmata, and stigmata are the wounds of Christ. The 5 wounds of Christ. And so it's just 3 lines. Spun glass treetops scatter dawn's glow. Red-breasted robins cluster below. Crimson wounds on Easter snow. And so that hadn't been in that position in the book. It had been earlier with the April snow one. And she said, what if we move it to the end? Because then you've got this lovely bookend of April snow, crimson wounds on Easter snow. She did that for me multiple times in the process. And really, I think the collection is a lot better, a lot stronger for her help on that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And
You did a workshop at Breathe called Writing to the Rhythm of My Feet. Can you talk about what that means to you, writing to the rhythm of your feet?
yeah, Anne asks about a workshop that I gave at the Breathe Writers Conference one year. And I called it Writing to the Rhythm of My Feet, because I love to walk. I love to walk out in nature, and I'm often writing in my head as I walk. So I always carry a journal, just a little pocket journal with me when I walk, and a pencil. And walking that, just the cadence of my footsteps really does something for me as a writer. And I've heard it said that like iambic pentameter, which is what Shakespeare wrote in, it's a form, so the iamb is the stressed, unstressed, or unstressed, stressed. And then the number of those in a line is 5, pentameter. It's our heartbeat. I've heard it said that it matches up with our heartbeat, and that's why we connect so deeply with things that are written in iambic pentameter. Shakespeare's not the only one that did that. So a lot of poetry is in that rhythm, and walking feels like that rhythm to me. So I get a lot of, first of all, visually, I get a lot of ideas when I'm out walking in nature. And then it just really opens up my soul. And just, so I'm an Enneagram 1, which means I see what's wrong with the world. Which is why I'm probably why I'm a good editor. Is because I can see what's wrong with the text. Like I can spot, oh, there should be a comma there, or there should not be a comma there. That word is spelled wrong. It's so easy for me to see things that are wrong, and that sometimes it makes me feel anxiety sometimes that it's not supposed to be this way. The world isn't supposed to be the way it is, right? The world was made perfect, and we were made for a perfect world. Being in nature, and I just read this recently, that for an Enneagram 1, being out in nature, walking like that, the world's the way it's supposed to. I'm looking at a tree that God made. It's perfect. I don't have to find anything wrong with that tree. I just write about it. And so I guess that's kind of what walking does for me. I learned that since I led that workshop. I mean, I only recently learned that about the connection between my personality and nature, and why it speaks to me so deeply, why I love it. So, yeah. So, Robin, I saw your hand go up.
You mainly answered what I was going to ask in that. I was going to ask if you designate time to write, or if you just, as you're walking or as you're going about life, you have things come to you and ask when you start writing?
Yeah, so Robin asked if I had a specific, like a designated time that I write, or whether I just like write as I'm going about my day, out for a walk or whatever. It's a bit of both. I usually have paper with me, and then Sean got me, I needed a new phone. And so he upgraded me to this, as it's an S22 Ultra, it's got this little pen that I don't think I have anyways. You pop the pen out and it opens a note right on the phone, and I can write. Like, right, so it's always there. And so sometimes I'll just be going about my ordinary day and a line will come to me and I'll scribble it down. Did that this afternoon. The best example of it, when that happened, there's a poem in here called Mechanics. And I had been working on this was one of these like 26 drafts poems. And I had been working on it for a long time about like how what I do as an editor, working with words with a red pencil, and comparing that to like how my dad would fix cars. Like I'm fixing these books and texts and things like that, and he would fix cars. But it was never, the poem wasn't done. And I just set it aside and forget about it. And then I come back to it. Still have it. I'm in the grocery store one day and I got my pen, right? I got my list, and I got my pen, and I'm crossing stuff. And I'm in the produce section and my list is just about done. And I go to cross off the last thing on it. It's one of those big roller ball, cheap ones. It had exploded. And my pen, it was like all over my hand. And I'm like, how am I gonna get this off and not stain my clothes? And all of a sudden I was like, my hand is filthy. And then the closing lines of this poem, Dad didn't understand that ink is just a different kind of grease. And his girl's fingers are filthy. And I was like, quick, write it down, so my pen had exploded. So I decided to myself, I'll check it out. So I could get back to the car where I knew there was a pencil or something somewhere and write it on the back of the receipt. But then I got home and I typed it in to my document, saved the new draft, and I realized, okay, the poem's done now.
And that one is really, I love the way it begins and ends.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, so. And I do write when I'm out walking too, Robin. And I designate quite often, I have a free Saturday morning, I'll mark it off for either going through my journal, my note app, pulling lines and seeing what comes, or revising old stuff and submitting it, because that's part of the process too, is submitting the work. So, yeah. Anybody else? Sally, hi.
Can you try to find different hiking areas so you're not observing the same things all the time?
Oh, that's a great question. Sally just asked if I try to find different hiking areas so that I'm not always observing the same things. I do love to find new places. But there is something cathartic for me about going to the same place. So this afternoon, I finished work at 2 this afternoon, so I could kind of clear space in my head for this night. And I went to Buck Creek Nature Preserve, which is just 1.5 miles from where we live in Wyoming. And I just walked the trail, and I do that trail all the time. I mean, if I have a free Saturday morning, I'll get up quite often early on a Saturday and get out there before anyone else is there. So I did that. But I do love finding new trails too. My favorite is still when we lived up north, the dirt road that we lived on. As much of a pain as it is to live on a dirt road, and it really is. But I loved that walk to the Pine River, to Cove Creek, Pine River, the little branch of the Pine River that came through there. And I do that walk every day, and you probably know which walk I'm talking about. And in fact, I was thinking about that today, like, I had this spot, I would sit right by the river, and it was like God made that spot for Amy's body. It was perfect. I was sitting by the creek, by Buck Creek, and it wasn't comfortable. It was not a comfortable spot. Like, I had to make, I was on a slope, and I'm, just sitting there, and it's like, man, I wish I was on the Pine River right now in that one spot that God made just for my body. So anyways, yeah, it's always good to find new places. I think some of my favorites were, when we were in England, we just found lots of new places to explore. Whenever we go on a trip, I always try to find a new place, a new trail to explore. So, yeah. Any other questions? Good.
You mentioned earlier that you have a right word.
Yeah.
Is there a process in that journey to get you to that right word?
Yeah.
Or an epiphany that you have when you get there, or how does that work?
Sure. So Doug asked if, when I mentioned when I talked about using the right word, is there a process to getting to that right word? And there is. Sometimes it's just a matter of trying different words. I have this book on my shelf called The Synonym Finder. That's what it's called. It's not called the Thesaurus, it's called The Synonym Finder. I found it for $1 up in Sault Ste. Marie in a little used bookstore up there. Best dollar I ever spent. Because it's got like lists of synonyms, right? And sometimes it's just finding like, this one has a little, I need a nuance, right? And actually those lines in the poem Mechanics, the word filthy, my editor and I went round and round on that word because that was originally the last poem in the book. And she's like, I don't think you should end with the word filthy. It's just negative. It's a negative connotation. And, I said, that's the right word. Like we both went and made lists of what else could be used there, and nothing worked. And I said, look, that's the right word. And she said, well, maybe you should pull that poem. And I'm like, I'm not pulling that poem. No, it's not coming out. It stays. I said, what about if I move it to where the work of our hands is, and I make the work of our hands the last poem? And she's like, oh, because the last line of that poem is, let his pleasure be upon us. She's like, oh, that works. Okay, it stays. So that's kind of the process. Yeah. So, yeah. I think we're at 8 o'clock here. So are there no other questions? Did you have something you wanted to?
No, I was just gonna say that after we close off our formal time, Amy will be signing copies. So if you do have a burning question that comes to you like in a few seconds, you can ask her personally. But Amy, if you would close us with one more.
I actually have one that I signed Sue. It's not in the book, actually. It's more recent. And I started it last year when we were with our cohort out in Holland at Soul Care Institute. And one of our leaders asked, I think it was my spiritual director, asked me the question, what do you want? What do you want, Amy? And I had started chewing on that. And then I had written some lines in my notebook there. And then I kind of forgot about that. And then I came back to these. I found the lines this spring on one of my Saturday cullings, right, of my notebooks. And I was like, yeah, I really love this. I need to develop this. And when I started writing the poem, it was Rosh Hashanah. And so I had done some reading, like what was Rosh Hashanah and what some of the customs of that. So I wrote this poem and I thought it would be a good way to close our time tonight because it is a prayer. So, in autumn splendor, a prayer on Rosh Hashanah. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who while the earth remains causes seasons to change. If I may be so bold, Adonai, I have some suggestions for the heaven and earth you're making new. Let it be always September, with honey light coating every leaf and blade and bale and shock of drying corn. Let butterflies sip at joe pie and tussle milkweed in a scatter of silvery down as they prepare to take flight. Let me wear blue jeans and a sweater and wool socks and these hiking boots that cushion my feet like a hug. Let there be a river and cool ravines where I can be alone with you among the green. Let there be oak trees shedding acorns, their chartreuse waistcoats not yet faded to nutty brown, and their tiny Harris tweed helmets still fastened tight to their heads instead of at drunken ankles. Let there be squirrels and chipmunks to collect them until their cheeks bulge and their winter stores are crammed. Let there be a steady thrum of cicadas in the pasture, all droning unison praise to you. Let there be maples tinged with orange and red, and golden beech and aspen hearts to carpet the forest floor. Let there be vis-a-vis trumpeting tequila, and sandhill cranes laughing cheverine reply. Let there be the scent of campfires and clove, pumpkin and pine, cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg incense of praise. Let me enjoy every day as much as I've enjoyed this one. World without end. Amen. Thanks so much.